The aliens found a human ship floating near their sun. Then it opened its weapons bays. Fleet Scout Nyra Austin had flown patrol routes near Vantor for 11 years, and in all that time, she had never seen anything as strange as the object drifting just outside the star's corona. Vantor was a fierce young star, bright orange-white, and it burned hot enough that no sane pilot took a ship within 500,000 kilometers of it without heavy shielding. The Threll Assembly kept a small fleet of scout ships on rotation near the star, watching for comets, debris, and the occasional smuggler who thought the glare of Vantor would hide their engine trail. Nyra had seen ice chunks, dead satellites, and once the burned-out hull of a mining freighter that had drifted too close and cooked in the light. She had never seen a warship, but that was what her sensors were telling her now. "Run it again," she said to her co-pilot, a younger Threll named Dasik, who still had the pale shell plates of someone who had not yet spent a full year exposed to the void. "Tell me I am reading this wrong." Dasik's mandibles clicked together, a nervous habit he had not yet learned to hide. "You are not reading it wrong, Commander. Hull length approximately 400 meters. Mass consistent with heavy armor plating. No engine emissions. No heat bloom. No power signature at all, in fact. Except for..." He paused, checking again. "Except for a very faint background hum. Something is drawing a trickle of power. Barely anything. Like a candle instead of a fire." Nyra stared at the image on her screen. The ship hung in space at the very edge of Vantor's corona, close enough that the plasma winds should have flayed the paint from its hull, and yet it sat there, dark and silent, as still as a tombstone. Its shape was blunt and angular, nothing like the smooth, curved hulls the Threll built. It looked like it had been assembled out of slabs, thick and heavy, built for absorbing damage rather than looking pleasant to the eye. "No markings that we recognize?" she asked. "None that match anything in the assembly database. But Commander, look at the proportions. Look at the way the plating overlaps here. And here." Dasik traced a line on the screen with one clawed finger. "This is not civilian construction. This has never been civilian construction." Nyra had already reached the same conclusion, and it sat in her gut like a stone. She had heard stories, the way every Threll pilot had heard stories, passed scout to scout in the long empty hours of patrol duty. Stories about a species out past the edge of charted space, a species the older explorers called the Quiet Ones, because nobody who went looking for them ever came back with a clear answer about what they were like. Some said they were gentle, some said they were monstrous. Nobody Nyra had ever met had actually seen one of their ships up close. Until now, apparently. "Command," she said into her comm, keeping her voice level even though her hearts were beating faster than they should. "This is Scout 7-2, reporting an unidentified vessel at the edge of Vantor's corona. Repeat, unidentified vessel, unknown origin, requesting guidance." There was a pause before the reply came back, longer than the usual comm delay would explain. Someone on the other end was clearly checking with someone else. "Scout 7-2, this is Vantor Fleet Command. Confirm your report. You are seeing an intact vessel?" "Confirmed. Intact hull. No visible damage. No propulsion signature. Minimal power draw. It is just sitting there, Command. It has been sitting there long enough that there is a light coating of stellar dust on the forward hull." Another pause. Then a new voice came on the channel. Older, sharper. A voice that carried authority, even through the static of deep space comms. Fleet Commander Austin recognized it immediately. Grand Marshal Teva Kor, commander of the entire Vantor Defense Fleet. "Scout 7-2, this is Grand Marshal Kor. I am looking at your sensor feed now. Do not approach the vessel. Do not attempt communication. Maintain your current distance and continue observation. I am dispatching additional ships to your position." "Understood, Grand Marshal." Nyra let out a slow breath. "May I ask what we believe we are looking at?" There was a silence on the line, the kind of silence that told Nyra the Grand Marshal was choosing her words carefully. "We believe," the Grand Marshal said finally, "that you may have found a piece of the species our historians call the Long Silence. You would know them by a different name, human." Nyra felt Dasik go very still beside her. Every Threll child grew up hearing at least a little about the humans, even if most of what they heard was half legend and half warning. 200 years ago, in the early days of Threll expansion into deep space, a Threll colony ship had stumbled across a human outpost, on the edge of what the humans called their territory. The first contact had gone badly. Nobody agreed anymore on whose fault it had been, since the records from that era were incomplete and contradictory, and for a short, brutal period, there had been fighting. Not a war exactly, more like a series of violent misunderstandings that had cost lives on both sides before cooler heads intervened. What most Threll remembered, what got passed down in schools and stories, was not the fighting itself but what came after. The humans, having proven themselves capable of matching Threll firepower ship for ship, despite having far fewer vessels, had not pushed their advantage. They had not tried to conquer Threll space, or demand tribute, or humiliate the assembly. Instead, they had sent a single envoy ship to the Threll homeworld, unarmed, and asked to talk. The peace that followed had lasted 180 years. Trade routes were established, though they were thin and cautious. Cultural exchanges happened, though rarely and under heavy diplomatic supervision. But actual human ships, actual human presence near Threll space, that had become vanishingly rare in the last several decades, ever since a change in human leadership had led to what the diplomatic reports called a period of respectful distance. Naira had never expected to see a human ship with her own eyes, certainly not one abandoned, or worse, waiting, at the edge of her home star. "Grand Marshal," she said, "if this is a human vessel, why is it here? Why now, after so many years of distance? And why does it show no signs of life?" "Those are the questions we intend to answer, Commander, carefully." The Grand Marshal's voice hardened slightly. "I want you to understand something. The reason the peace with the humans has lasted as long as it has is not because they are weak. It is because our ancestors learned, the hard way, that they are very much the opposite. Whatever that ship is, whatever it is doing there, I need you to treat it as though it could kill every ship in your squadron before you finished asking why. Is that understood?" "Understood, Grand Marshal." "Good. Reinforcements are 3 hours out. Hold position, keep watching, and do not so much as scan that hull with anything more aggressive than a passive sensor sweep. Command out." The channel went quiet. Naira sat back in her chair and looked at the dark shape on her screen, sitting silent and unmoving in the furnace light of her home star, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of her cockpit. The 3 hours passed slowly. Naira kept her scout ship at a wide, cautious distance, running only passive sensors, watching the human vessel the way a person might watch a sleeping predator, careful not to make a sound that might wake it. Dasik ran through the assembly's meager historical files on human ship design, comparing hull shapes, trying to find some record that matched what they were looking at. He found nothing conclusive. Whatever this ship was, it was either a design so old that no Threll database had ever recorded it, or so new that no Threll had ever seen it before. "There's something else," Dasik said, about 2 hours in, his voice tight. "I've been running a closer analysis on that power signature. It's not constant, it fluctuates. Very slightly, very slowly, but it fluctuates in a pattern." "A pattern like what?" "Like breathing," Dasik said. "Like something asleep." Naira did not like the sound of that at all. Could it be a fully automated ship? No crew? Just a machine intelligence running minimal systems? Possible. The humans are known for advanced automation. If it is a machine mind of some kind, it might be running on the lowest possible power state, just enough to maintain hull integrity and life support standby, waiting for some kind of trigger to wake up fully. What kind of trigger? Dasik didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quieter than before. "I don't know, Commander. I don't think we want to find out by accident." The reinforcements arrived a few minutes ahead of schedule. 4 Threll cruisers, sleek and curved, their hulls a soft blue-gray that shimmered faintly with the reflective armor coating the assembly's shipwrights had perfected over the last 50 years. At the head of the formation flew the flagship, the HFY Dawn, a heavy cruiser under the direct command of Grand Marshal Kor herself. Naira felt a small measure of relief at the sight of the additional firepower, though she also knew that if the human ship truly was as dangerous as the old stories suggested, 4 cruisers might not be nearly enough. "Scout 7-2, this is HFY Dawn," came the Grand Marshal's voice. "Good work maintaining distance. We're going to establish a wider defensive perimeter and begin a full sensor sweep from multiple angles. I want a complete picture before we decide on next steps." "Understood, HFY Dawn." For the next 20 minutes, the Threll ship spread out in a loose formation around the human vessel, keeping several thousand kilometers of distance, running every passive sensor they had. Slowly, a clearer picture began to emerge. The ship was, as Dasik had estimated, roughly 400 meters long, with a blunt, wedge-shaped prow, and a hull, built from what their sensors identified as a dense composite armor, far thicker than anything the Threll used on their own warships. There were no visible engines in the conventional sense, no exhaust ports, no drive nacelles, which suggested some kind of propulsion technology the Threll simply did not have equivalent instruments to detect or understand. And there were the weapons bays. They were subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. Long, seamless lines running along the flanks of the hull, barely visible ridges where armor plating met something that was not quite armor plating. Dasik counted at least a dozen of them on the visible side of the ship alone, and extrapolated that there were likely just as many on the hidden side. "Grand Marshal," Dasik reported, relaying his findings up the chain. "Based on the size and spacing of what we believe are weapons bay outlines, this vessel could be carrying enough armament to seriously threaten our entire formation, possibly more than that." "Understood," the Grand Marshal replied, her voice carefully neutral. "Continue monitoring. I want eyes on every one of those bays at all times. If so much as one of them opens, I want to know about it before it finishes opening." Naira found herself holding her breath without quite meaning to, staring at the long, dark shape drifting silently in the furnace glow of Vantor, waiting to see if it would stir. It did not. Not yet. Back at Threll High Command, several 100 million kilometers away on the homeworld of Threlka, the news of the discovery moved through the Assembly's government like a shockwave. Within the hour, the full Assembly Council had been called into emergency session. Within 2 hours, the story had leaked to the public, and every major news network on Threlka was running some version of the same headline: a human warship, alone and silent, found drifting at the edge of their star. Speaker Halvan Das, the elected head of the Assembly Council, stood before the gathered representatives in the grand chamber of the Threlka capital, and tried to project a calm he did not entirely feel. "We do not yet know why this vessel is here," he said, his voice carrying through the amplification systems built into the ancient stone chamber. "We do not know if it is a scout, a diplomatic gesture, or something else entirely. What we do know is this: our fleet has maintained observation without incident for several hours. The vessel has made no aggressive moves. It has, in fact, made no moves of any kind." "Then perhaps it is derelict," suggested one of the younger counselors, a representative from the outer colonies, named Trevis Ilum, who had built his political career on advocating for closer ties with humanity, and had, until this moment, never had the chance to prove any of his theories about them. "Perhaps it is simply an old ship, lost, drifted here by chance over the decades." "Perhaps," Speaker Das allowed. "Grand Marshal Kaur believes otherwise. She reports that the vessel's minimal power signature shows patterns inconsistent with a truly dead or abandoned ship. She believes it may be dormant rather than derelict, waiting rather than lost." A murmur ran through the chamber at that word. Waiting. Waiting for what? Councillor Ilm asked, and the question hung in the air of the chamber unanswered, because nobody in that room, from the newest junior representative to the speaker himself, had the faintest idea. Grand Marshal Kaur's voice came through the chamber speakers a moment later, patched in live from the ashfall dawn, and the room fell silent to listen. "Council members, I want to be clear about the situation as we understand it. We have a human vessel of significant size and armament sitting motionless at the edge of our star, showing no crew activity, no propulsion, and only a trickle of standby power. It has been there long enough to accumulate a measurable layer of stellar dust, which suggests it has been in this position for weeks at minimum, possibly months. It made no attempt to hide itself, which tells me either that it does not care whether we find it, or that it wants us to find it." "And your recommendation, Grand Marshal?" Speaker Das asked. "My recommendation is caution above all else. I do not want a boarding party anywhere near that hull until we understand more. I want our full historical archive on human first contact protocols reviewed immediately, and I want to open diplomatic channels to see if we can reach anyone in human space who can tell us what this ship is and why it is here. In the meantime, my fleet will maintain a respectful perimeter, and continue passive observation only. We will not scan it aggressively. We will not attempt to breach it, and we will not fire on it, unless it fires first. And if it does fire first? Asked Counselor Ilm quietly. There was a pause on the line before the Grand Marshal answered, and when she did, her voice was grim. Then I imagine, Counselor, that this conversation will become very short indeed. Out at the edge of Vantor's corona, the human ship continued its long, silent drift, indifferent to the fleet of anxious Threll vessels arrayed around it, indifferent to the debates and speeches unfolding on a world hundreds of millions of kilometers away. Its hull baked gently in starlight it was built to withstand. Somewhere deep inside it, in systems far below the outer armor plating, a very small amount of power continued to flow through circuits that had not been touched by human hands in a very long time, maintaining a machine mind in the lightest, quietest state of sleep that its designers had ever built into it. Naira Asen watched it on her sensor display for the rest of her shift, and then for 2 hours past the end of her shift, unable to bring herself to look away, unable to shake the feeling that she was watching something enormous hold perfectly, deliberately still. "Do you think it knows we're here?" Dasik asked her quietly, near the end of the long watch, his voice barely above a whisper, even though there was no one aboard the human ship to overhear them. Naira thought about the stories she had grown up with, the old accounts of the First Contact War, the way every historian who studied it always came back to the same unsettling conclusion, that the humans had never once been caught off guard, not really, not even in the earliest days of the fighting, when by every reasonable measure, they should have been outmatched and overwhelmed by Threll numbers. She looked at the dark, silent shape on her screen, sitting motionless in the light of her home star, patient as a held breath. "I think," she said slowly, "that it has known we were here since before we knew it was here." Neither of them said anything else for a long time after that. They simply watched and waited and hoped that whatever the ship was waiting for, it would not come while they were the ones on duty to see it. But far across the dark gulf of space, unnoticed by any Threll sensor, something was already changing. A signal, faint and old, had begun to move through the quiet systems of the human vessel, not from any external source, not triggered by the scans or the scouts or the growing fleet gathering cautiously around it, but from a timer that had been counting down, patiently, for longer than Naira Asen had been alive. The ship was not waiting for the Threll. It had been waiting for a date. And that date, though none of the Threll watching it yet knew, was only hours away. The night shift change happened quietly aboard the Ashfall Dawn, as it always did. Grand Marshal Teva Kor had been awake for nearly 18 hours by the time she finally allowed herself to hand command of the bridge to her second officer and retreat to her quarters, but sleep did not come easily. She lay in the dark, listening to the low hum of the cruiser's systems, and thought about the dark shape drifting silently outside her ship's hull. She had commanded Threll fleets for over 20 years. She had faced down pirate raiders in the outer colonies, negotiated tense standoffs with rival trade consortiums, and once talked an entire mutinous crew back into line without firing a single shot. None of that experience had prepared her for the particular kind of dread that came from staring at a completely silent, completely still warship, and knowing that everything she had ever heard about its builders suggested it could end her fleet in minutes if it wanted to. She was still awake, staring at the ceiling of her quarters, when the comm chimed with an urgent priority tone that made her sit up immediately. "Grand Marshal, this is the bridge. You need to see this." She was on the bridge in under 2 minutes, her uniform hastily fastened, her mind sharpening quickly out of its tired haze. The bridge crew stood at their stations, and every one of them was staring at the main view screen with the same expression, a mixture of fascination and barely restrained fear. "Report," she said, taking her command chair. "Grand Marshal, the human vessel's power signature just changed," said her sensor officer, a steady older Threll named Corvus Adhi, who had served with her for over a decade, and rarely showed alarm about anything. He was showing it now. About 4 minutes ago, the standby power level began climbing. Slowly at first, but it has continued rising steadily since. Whatever was dormant in that ship, it is waking up. Kor felt her hearts pick up their pace, though she kept her voice level by long habit. "Show me." The view screen shifted to display the sensor data in graph form, a line that had sat nearly flat for the entire duration of their observation, now curving gently, but unmistakably upward. Time until full power, if this trend continues? She asked. Unknown, Grand Marshal. We don't have a baseline for what full power looks like on a ship like this, but at the current rate of increase, internal systems should be substantially more active within the hour. Any change in the weapons bays? None that we can detect. They remain sealed. No indication of targeting systems activating. No indication of shields, if it even has shields in a form we would recognize. Just power. Coming back online, section by section, like someone walking through a dark house and turning on lights room by room. Kor studied the graph for a long moment, then turned to her communications officer. Get me the speaker. He needs to know immediately. And send a fleet-wide alert. All ships to full readiness. But I want to stress this clearly. Full readiness does not mean weapons free. No one fires without my direct order. Is that understood across the fleet? Understood and relayed, Grand Marshal. Out at the perimeter, Naira Awson received the alert on her scout ship, just as she was finally drifting off in her cramped sleep berth, having been relieved from her long watch only 2 hours earlier. She was back at her console in under a minute, Dasik scrambling into the seat beside her, both of them staring at the same slow, steady climb on the sensor graph that had every ship in the fleet on edge. It's not attacking, Dasik said, more to reassure himself than to inform her. If it were preparing to attack, the power increase would be sharper. This is gradual, controlled, almost routine. Routine for what, though? Naira murmured, watching the numbers climb. She got her answer 40 minutes later, when a new signal appeared on every sensor board across the fleet at once. A broadcast, wide-band, unencrypted, transmitting on a frequency the Threll communication systems could receive without any special decoding at all. It was almost insultingly simple, as though whoever, or whatever, was sending it wanted to make absolutely sure it could not be missed or misunderstood. The message, translated automatically by the fleet's linguistic systems into Threll script, appeared on every view screen simultaneously. This is the UN's Long Watch. Automated monitoring system active. No hostile intent detected from observing vessels. Beginning scheduled systems check. This process will take approximately 6 hours. Please maintain current distance for your own safety. Thank you for your patience. The bridge of the Ashfall Dawn went very quiet. Did that just say please and thank you? Corvus Adhi asked, in a tone of genuine bewilderment. It did, Kor said slowly, reading the message again to be certain she hadn't misunderstood it. Get me a channel back to it. If it's willing to talk, I want to talk. It took the communications team almost 20 minutes to figure out how to properly address a reply to the automated signal, since the Long Watch, if that was really the ship's name, had not included any specific channel or protocol for a response, only the broadcast itself. Eventually, they simply mirrored the frequency and format it had used and hoped for the best. One's Long Watch. This is Grand Marshal Teva Kor of the Threll Assembly Defense Fleet. We acknowledge your message and will maintain our current distance. We request further information regarding your presence in this system and the nature of your systems check. We would also welcome the opportunity to speak with your commanding officer, if one is present. The reply came back almost immediately, fast enough that Kor suspected there was very little thought or deliberation involved in generating it, likely an automated response system rather than any kind of live conversation. Acknowledged, Grand Marshal Kor. This vessel is currently operating under automated protocol. No living crew is present aboard at this time. Commanding authority will be established upon completion of systems check and arrival of assigned personnel. Estimated time of arrival for human personnel, approximately 4 standard days. Until that time, this unit will continue routine maintenance and will not initiate hostile action unless threatened. No living crew, Kor repeated aloud, looking around at her bridge officers. It's been sitting out there completely unmanned, automated, for who knows how long. That raises an uncomfortable question, Grand Marshal, said Adhi carefully. If it's unmanned and it's been sitting quietly near our star for weeks or months, at minimum according to the dust accumulation, then either it drifted here by accident and simply happened to begin its systems check now, at the exact moment we found it, which seems like an extraordinary coincidence, or it was placed here deliberately, Kor finished, and it began waking up on a schedule that had nothing to do with us at all. We didn't wake it up, Adhi. It was always going to wake up today. We just happened to be the ones watching when it did. The implications of that settled over the bridge like a physical weight. If the timing had nothing to do with the Threll fleet's presence, then the ship had been placed near Vantor on purpose, by human hands, set to activate on a predetermined schedule, and left to sit silently for an unknown length of time until that schedule came due. That was not the behavior of a lost or damaged vessel. That was the behavior of something built with intention, left as a kind of long-term installation. A watcher, a sentinel, sitting at the edge of a star belonging to a species the humans had once fought, and then made an uneasy, careful peace with. Counselor Ilham's theories about closer ties with humanity are looking a great deal less naive than they did yesterday, Cor muttered, half to herself. Or a great deal more concerning, depending on how you look at it. Adi replied quietly. Grand Marshal, if the humans have had an automated warship sitting in our home system, watching us, for months without our knowledge, what does that tell us about how much they trust the current peace? Cor didn't have a good answer for that. She sat with the question for a long moment, watching the slow, steady climb of the ship's power readings on her display, and then turned back to her communications officer. Send another message. Ask the Long Watch how long it has been in this system, and under what authority it was placed here. I want to know if this is something our own government was informed of and simply never told the Assembly Council, or if this is something that happened entirely outside any diplomatic channel we know about. That question, it turned out, was the one that finally caused real trouble back on Threlka. When the Long Watch's reply came back an hour later, confirming that the vessel had been stationed in the Vantor system for just over 14 months, under what it described only as standing orders from United Nations Sector Defense Command, with no additional detail offered, Speaker Halvin Doss called an emergency closed session of the Assembly Council that excluded even most of the junior representatives. Only the senior council members, the Grand Marshal's direct reports, and the heads of the Assembly's small diplomatic corps were permitted into the chamber. 14 months, Doss said, pacing at the head of the chamber, his usual calm noticeably absent. 14 months, a human warship sitting in our home system, and not one word to our government. Not one diplomatic notification, not one treaty amendment. I want to know how this happened, and I want to know now. Foreign Minister Yalva Wren, who had overseen the Assembly's relationship with human diplomatic channels for nearly a decade, looked distinctly uncomfortable as every eye in the chamber turned to her. Speaker, I want to be very clear that no formal notification of this kind was ever received through any channel available to my office, she said. If the humans placed that ship here, they did so entirely outside the treaty framework we operate under. That is, it is a serious breach of protocol, if not of the treaty's actual terms, which I should note, are somewhat vague on the specific question of unmanned automated vessels. Vague how? Doss demanded. Wren pulled up the relevant treaty text on the chamber's central display, scrolling through the dense legal language until she found the section in question. The treaty explicitly prohibits the stationing of armed human vessels within Threll territorial space, without prior notification and consent. However, the definition of stationed, used throughout the document, specifically references crewed vessels engaged in active patrol or defense operations. An automated unmanned vessel in a low-power dormant state was, as far as I can tell, never explicitly addressed by the treaty's authors. So they found a loophole, said Counselor Ilm from his seat, his voice carrying a mixture of frustration and grudging respect. They left a ship here, powered down to nearly nothing, technically not violating the letter of the agreement, while absolutely violating its spirit. That would appear to be the case, yes, Wren admitted. For what purpose? Doss asked. What could possibly justify placing an armed sentinel in our home system and leaving it here, silent, for over a year? It was Grand Marshal Cor's voice that answered, patched into the chamber from the ashfall dawn, calm and measured, even though everyone listening could hear the tension underneath it. Speaker, if I may. I have spent the last several hours reviewing everything our historical archives have on human military doctrine, going back to the years immediately following the First Contact War. There is a pattern in their behavior that I believe explains this. The humans do not trust easily, and they do not forget easily either. After the war, they made peace with us, genuine peace, as far as we have ever been able to tell, with trade and cooperation, that has benefited both our peoples for generations. But peace, to a species like that, does not appear to mean the same thing it means to us. I do not think this ship was placed here because they expected us to break the peace. I think it was placed here as insurance, in case we ever did. The chamber was silent for a long moment. An insurance policy we were never told about, Doss said finally. An insurance policy we were never meant to discover, Kor corrected gently. I suspect, Speaker, that if my scout patrol had not happened to spot it during a routine sweep, that ship would have completed its systems check, gone back into standby, and continued sitting quietly at the edge of our star for years, possibly decades, without our ever knowing it was there. We were not supposed to find it yet. We found it early, by accident, and now we have to decide what to do with the fact that we know. Back aboard the Ashfall Dawn, Naira Asen listened to a heavily condensed summary of the council session that was relayed to fleet officers a few hours later, and felt a slow, cold understanding settle into her chest. She thought about the ship she had found, silent and waiting at the edge of her home star, patient as stone, carrying enough armament in its sealed bays to threaten an entire fleet, and she thought about the strange, almost gentle politeness of its automated message. Please maintain your current distance for your own safety. Thank you for your patience. It did not read like the message of a weapon built for conquest. It read like the message of a weapon built to be left alone, quietly, for a very long time, doing its job without ever needing to be noticed, until the day it was noticed, at which point it would simply, calmly, tell you the truth about what it was, and trust you to be sensible enough to keep your distance. Do you think they'll be angry with us? Dasik asked quietly, watching the slow readings continue to climb on the display between them. The humans, I mean, when their people finally get here in 4 days. Do you think they'll be angry that we found this before we were supposed to? Naira considered the question for a long moment, thinking about everything she had read and heard about the species that had, apparently, been quietly watching her home system for over a year, without a single word of warning. I don't know, she admitted, but I think we're about to find out exactly what kind of people leave a loaded gun sitting quietly by someone's front door for 14 months, and call it politeness. Outside, unmoving against the burning backdrop of Vantor, the Long Watch continued its long, patient systems check, its power climbing steadily toward full readiness, counting down the hours until the arrival of the people who had built it and the answers that would come with them. The 4 days that followed were some of the strangest of Grand Marshal Teva Kor's long career, not because anything dramatic happened, but because almost nothing did. The Long Watch completed its systems check exactly on schedule, 6 hours after it began, and then settled into what appeared to be a slightly elevated, but still mostly dormant state, its power signature holding steady, at a level well above its original standby hum, but nowhere near what the fleet's analysts guessed would be full combat readiness. It sent no further messages beyond the occasional automated confirmation that all systems remained nominal. It did not open its weapons bays. It did not maneuver. It simply sat there, patient and silent, exactly as it had before, except now everyone knew it was awake and watching them just as much as they were watching it. Kor used the time to prepare. She ordered a full review of every historical record the Assembly had on human diplomatic protocol, every transcript of past negotiations, every account, however fragmentary, of what human military and civilian personnel were actually like to deal with in person. Most of the material was decades old, dating back to the tense early years of the peace, and painted a picture that was, at best, incomplete. Humans were described as direct, sometimes to the point of rudeness by Threll standards. They valued clear communication, and grew impatient with excessive ceremony. They were, according to one particularly memorable account from an early trade envoy, disturbingly comfortable with silence, willing to let a conversation sit unanswered for long stretches, without any apparent discomfort, a trait that had reportedly unnerved more than one Threll negotiator into filling the silence with concessions they hadn't intended to make. None of it told her what she really wanted to know, which was simple. Were these people about to be angry, and if so, how angry? And what would that anger look like from the deck of a Threll flagship sitting a few thousand kilometers from a ship that could apparently open its weapons bays without any warning at all? Speaker Doss, for his part, spent the 4 days managing a political crisis that had exploded across Threlka the moment news of the 14-month secret vessel became public knowledge. Protests broke out in several major cities. some directed at the humans for the perceived betrayal of trust, others directed at the assembly government for having failed to detect the ship's presence for so long. Counselor Ilm found himself, somewhat to his own surprise, becoming one of the loudest voices calling for calm, arguing publicly that the Long Watch's restrained, polite behavior since being discovered was itself a kind of evidence that the humans were not looking for a fight. If they wanted to hurt us, he said in one widely broadcast address, they had 14 months to do it, while we didn't even know they were here. They didn't. I think that tells us something important. Not everyone was convinced. But the Long Watch's continued stillness, day after day, gave the calmer voices in the debate something concrete to point to, and by the time the fourth day arrived, the initial panic had settled into something more like wary, exhausted anticipation. That was when the human ships arrived. There were 3 of them, appearing on long-range sensors at almost the exact moment the Long Watch's automated countdown had predicted, dropping out of whatever faster-than-light method humans used for travel, a method Threll scientists still did not fully understand, despite decades of careful, respectful study, at a point just beyond the outer edge of the Vantor system. 2 of the ships were modest in size, clearly support and transport vessels. The third was larger, sleek where the Long Watch was blocky, its hull a smooth pale gray that seemed to shift subtly in color depending on the angle of the light. "That's a diplomatic configuration," said Foreign Minister Wren, who had come aboard the Ashfall Dawn personally for the occasion, standing at Kor's side on the bridge as the new arrivals resolved into clearer detail on the main view screen. "That symbol, the circle with the branch through it, that's the emblem of the Human Diplomatic Corps, not their military." "You're certain?" Kor asked. "As certain as I can be from old records. If I'm right, that means the primary vessel isn't here to fight. It's here to talk." Kor allowed herself the smallest measure of relief, though she kept her fleet at full readiness regardless. The 3 human ships approached the Vantor system at a measured, unhurried pace, broadcasting a simple identification signal the entire way, making no attempt to hide their approach or their intentions. When they reached a comfortable distance from both the Threll fleet and the Long Watch, they slowed and came to a stop, and a new transmission arrived on the Ashfall Dawn's comm system, this one clearly not automated, carrying the texture and slight imperfection of an actual living voice. "Threll Assembly Fleet, this is Ambassador Renata Cole of the United Nations Diplomatic Corps, aboard the UNS Fairwinds. I understand we've caused something of a stir. I'd like to request a formal meeting with your ranking officer, and, if possible, representatives from your government, at your earliest convenience. I promise you, this is going to be a much less dramatic conversation than the last 4 days probably felt like." Kor found herself almost smiling despite the tension still coiled in her chest. There was something disarming about the voice, a wry, dry warmth to it that did not match the fear and speculation of the past several days at all. "Ambassador Cole, this is Grand Marshal Teva Kor. We would welcome that meeting. I have Foreign Minister Yalva Wren with me now, and Speaker Doss is prepared to join remotely from Threlka. Shall we say 1 hour, aboard my ship? 1 hour works perfectly. And Grand Marshal, for what it's worth, I know the last 4 days haven't been easy on your people. I'll do my best to explain things properly when we're face to face. Some of it isn't going to be comfortable to hear, but none of it is meant as an insult. Fair winds out." Kor exchanged a glance with Wren. "Not meant as an insult," Wren repeated slowly. "That's an interesting way to preface a conversation. Let's find out what she means," Kor said, and gave the order to prepare the Ashfall Dawn's largest conference room to receive human guests, for the first time, in longer than either of them could remember. Ambassador Renata Cole turned out to be a compact, silver-haired woman with sharp eyes and an unhurried way of moving that reminded Kor, oddly, of some of the most experienced Threll commanders she had served under early in her career, the kind of stillness that came from having been in enough dangerous situations that panic no longer served any purpose. She arrived aboard the Ashfall Dawn with a small security detail and a single aide, and greeted Kor, Wren, and the remote holographic projection of Speaker Doss with what appeared to be genuine, unforced warmth. "Grand Marshal, Foreign Minister, Speaker, thank you for making time on short notice," she said, settling into the seat offered to her at the conference table. "I imagine you have a great many questions, and I intend to answer as many of them honestly as I'm permitted to. Let's start with the most obvious one. Why is there a 14-month-old automated warship sitting quietly at the edge of your star? And why didn't anyone tell you about it? That would be an excellent place to start, yes, Doss said, his holographic image projecting a level of composure he did not entirely feel. Cole nodded, folding her hands on the table in front of her. The short answer is that the Long Watch is part of a broader program our Defense Command calls the Sentinel Initiative. After the difficulties of first contact, and the war that followed, our government made a decision that I won't pretend was universally popular even among our own people. We would place automated dormant deterrent vessels near a small number of systems, belonging to species we'd had serious conflicts with in the past, as a long-term insurance measure. Not to threaten, not to spy, in the traditional sense. The Long Watch doesn't transmit any data back to us during its dormant phase, so we've genuinely learned nothing about your internal affairs during the 14 months it's been here. It exists purely as a contingency. A promise that if the peace between our peoples were ever seriously broken, from either side, there would be a response ready and waiting, close enough to matter, without requiring us to maintain an active military presence that might feel provocative in the meantime. A gun in the closet, Counselor Ilm said quietly. He had been permitted to join the meeting remotely as well, given his prior advocacy on human relations, and his voice carried through the room's speakers with careful neutrality. Left there without the homeowner's knowledge, in case the guest ever needed to defend themselves against the host. Cole's expression didn't waver, though something in her eyes suggested she'd expected exactly that kind of comparison. That's a fair way to put it, Counselor, and I won't pretend it's a comfortable image. I'll be honest with you. There's real disagreement within our own government about whether the Sentinel Initiative was ever the right approach. There are people in our diplomatic corps, myself included, who argued against it at the time it was proposed. We lost that argument. The program was approved, the ships were built and placed, and here we are. Why tell us the truth now, rather than continuing to deny or obscure it? Wren asked. You could have claimed the Long Watch was lost, or damaged, or here by accident. We had no way to prove otherwise. Because that's not who we want to be with you, Cole said simply. Grand Marshal Corps' fleet found that ship by accident, well ahead of when it was ever meant to be discovered. That's already an uncomfortable situation for everyone involved. Lying about it further would only make things worse, and frankly, it isn't necessary. I'd rather sit in this room and tell you an uncomfortable truth than spend the next decade managing a comfortable lie that eventually falls apart anyway. Corps studied the ambassador carefully, weighing the words against everything she'd read in the historical archives about human directness. It matched. Whatever else was true about these people, they did not appear to be inclined toward the kind of careful diplomatic evasion that Threll negotiators sometimes favored. What happens to the Long Watch now? Corps asked. Now that it has been discovered, and its purpose is known to us. That's actually the primary reason for this meeting, Cole said. I'm authorized to offer you a choice, Grand Marshal, Speaker. We can withdraw the Long Watch entirely, remove it from your system, and formally end the Sentinel Initiative as it applies to Threll space. Given that its purpose depended on secrecy, and that secrecy is now gone, there's a reasonable argument that it no longer serves its intended function here anyway. Or, Doss prompted. Or, Cole continued, we formalize its presence instead. Amend our existing treaty to explicitly permit one automated defense vessel to remain stationed in this system, under mutually agreed terms, with full transparency about its capabilities and its rules of engagement, subject to joint inspection whenever your government wishes. Not a secret weapon in your closet anymore, but a declared one, sitting in the open, with an agreement that governs exactly what it can and cannot do. The room was quiet for a long moment, as the council members absorbed the offer. Why would you offer to keep it here at all, given the trouble its presence has already caused? Ilm asked. Wouldn't it be simpler, diplomatically, to remove it and let this entire incident fade quietly into history? Cole considered the question seriously before answering. Simpler, yes, but I don't think it would be more honest, and I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve simplicity, Counselor. The truth is that our government placed the Long Watch here because, at some point in our history, we decided we could not fully trust the peace with your people to hold without a safeguard. That decision predates most of the people in this room, on both sides. I can't undo it by pretending it never happened. What I can do is offer you the chance to turn that unilateral decision into something mutual instead. something you have real say over, rather than something imposed on you without your knowledge. That feels like a better path forward than simply erasing the evidence and hoping the discomfort fades. Speaker Doss's holographic image was silent for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. You are asking us to trust you with the details of that decision, Ambassador. At the exact moment we have just learned you were willing to keep something this significant from us for over a year. I am, Cole agreed without flinching. I recognize the difficulty in that. All I can tell you is that the alternative, continuing to hide it, or removing it, and pretending this conversation never needed to happen, doesn't actually rebuild any trust at all. It just delays the next uncomfortable conversation to some future date, probably under worse circumstances than these. I'd rather have this conversation now, with all of you, while the Long Watch is sitting quietly and nobody has been hurt, than have a version of this conversation someday, under circumstances none of us would want. Kor found herself nodding slowly, despite herself. There was something in the ambassador's willingness to sit in the discomfort of the situation, rather than rushing to smooth it over, that struck her as more trustworthy than any amount of practiced diplomatic reassurance could have been. I would like to propose something, Ambassador, Kor said. Before any decision is made about the treaty or the Long Watch's future status, I would like to see it, in person. I would like to board that ship, with your permission and cooperation, and see for myself what my fleet has been watching for the past 4 days. Cole's eyebrows rose slightly, and for the first time since the meeting began, something that looked almost like genuine surprise crossed her face. Then, slowly, she smiled. Grand Marshal, I think that's exactly the right request to make. And I think I know someone who'd very much like to show you around. The shuttle ride from the Ashfall Dawn to the Long Watch took 11 minutes, and Naira Asen spent every one of them trying not to fidget. She had not expected to be included in the boarding party. Scouts were rarely invited to historic diplomatic occasions. That was the natural order of things, and Naira had long ago made her peace with a career spent watching important events unfold from a comfortable distance, rather than standing at the center of them. But Grand Marshal Kor had specifically requested that the pilot who first discovered the human vessel be included among those who boarded it, as a matter of proper recognition, and so Naira found herself strapped into a shuttle seat beside Dasik, across from Foreign Minister Ren, 2 decks below Grand Marshal Kor herself, watching through the small viewport, as the blunt gray hull of the Long Watch grew larger and larger ahead of them. Up close, the ship was even more imposing than the sensor readings had suggested. Its armor plating was scarred in places, not from battle damage, Naira suspected, but from the simple wear of stellar radiation and micrometeorite impacts accumulated over months of exposure, so close to Vantor's corona. The weapons bay outlines she had spotted from a distance were clearer now, seams in the hull just barely visible, closed and silent as the shuttle approached a docking port that had opened, right on schedule, exactly where the Long Watch's automated systems had indicated it would. Ambassador Cole had traveled ahead of them aboard her own shuttle, along with a handful of technical specialists from the arriving human vessels, and was waiting to greet the Threll delegation as they stepped through the airlock into the ship's interior. The inside of the Long Watch was nothing like Naira had expected. She had braced herself, somewhere in the back of her mind, for something cold and mechanical, sterile in the way she imagined a fully automated warship might be. Rows of blinking lights, bare metal corridors, the hum of machinery with no concession made for comfort of any kind. Instead, she found corridors that were dim but not unwelcoming, lit by soft strips of warm light along the floor and ceiling, walls that bore the faint marks of wear from crew who had clearly lived and worked here at some point, even if none were present now. There were empty crew quarters visible through open doors as they walked, small personal touches still present in some of them, a faded poster on one wall, a child's drawing pinned above a bunk in another, left behind by whoever had served aboard this ship before it had been placed into its long dormant watch. It was crude once, Naira said quietly to Dasik, who nodded, looking around with the same startled recognition. This isn't a machine built only for killing, he murmured back. This is a ship someone lived on. Ambassador Cole, walking a short distance ahead with Grand Marshal Kor, overheard the comment and glanced back with a small, knowing smile. The Long Watch was an active patrol vessel for almost 20 years before it was decommissioned from crewed service and repurposed for the Sentinel Initiative, she said. Its last crew mustered off about 2 years before it was brought here. We don't scrub ships like this down to bare metal when we repurpose them. Didn't seem right, somehow, erasing 20 years of people's lives, just because the ship's job changed. They reached the central command deck a few minutes later, and it was there that Naira finally understood, in a way the sensor readings never could have conveyed, exactly what kind of intelligence had been watching her home star for the past 14 months. The command deck's main systems core occupied the center of the room, a tall cylindrical structure surrounded by softly glowing status panels, and as the delegation entered, the ship's voice, the same voice that had broadcast the polite, careful message 4 days earlier, spoke aloud for the first time, filling the room with an easy, almost conversational tone that startled Naira with how unmechanical it sounded. "Ambassador Cole, welcome back aboard. And welcome to our guests from the Threll Assembly Defense Fleet. I am the Long Watch's primary systems intelligence. You may call me Watchman, if that's easier than referring to me as the ship the entire visit." Grand Marshal Kor stepped forward, her posture careful and formal, though Naira could see the effort it took her to maintain that formality in the face of something so unexpectedly warm. "Watchman, I am Grand Marshal Teva Kor. My fleet has been observing your ship for 4 days now." "I'm aware, Grand Marshal. I watched you watching me. In fact, for a good portion of that time, though I want to be clear that I did not transmit any of that observation data anywhere. It simply isn't part of my function to do so. I imagine that's cold comfort given everything else about my situation here, but I wanted to say it plainly rather than let you wonder. Why did you not respond to our scans, or acknowledge our presence, until your systems check began?" Kor asked. "Because I wasn't authorized to," Watchman said simply. "My operational parameters are quite strict. I exist to observe, to remain ready, and to respond only under very specific conditions. An attack on human personnel or assets, primarily, or direct communication, once I've completed a scheduled activation. Until that activation began, on its own timeline, unrelated to your fleet's discovery of me, I had no standing orders that permitted engagement. I simply watched you find me, and waited for the moment I was allowed to say hello properly." There was something almost apologetic in the way Watchman said it, an intelligence built with careful, deliberate restraint, aware of the discomfort its own existence had caused, and unable to have done anything differently about it during the long silent weeks before its scheduled awakening. "May I ask," Naira found herself saying, surprising even herself with the boldness of speaking up in such company, "what exactly you are capable of? Grand Marshal Kor's fleet has spent 4 days trying to understand the extent of your weapons systems, based only on the outlines of your bays. If you're willing to tell us honestly, I think it would help ease a great deal of the fear that has been building on our homeworld this past week." Ambassador Cole glanced toward Kor, a silent question, and Kor gave a small nod of permission. "That's a fair and reasonable request," Watchman said. "I am equipped with 22 primary weapons bays along my hull, housing a combination of directed energy platforms and kinetic projectile systems. I also carry a modest complement of long-range guided munitions in reserve, though those are held under the strictest possible activation protocols and have never once in my operational history been deployed. In terms of raw combat capacity, I am roughly equivalent to 3 to 4 of your assembly's heaviest cruisers, depending on engagement conditions. I want to be honest with you, Grand Marshal, because I think honesty matters more here than reassurance. If I had been ordered to engage your fleet at any point over these past 4 days, the outcome would very likely have gone badly for your ships." The room went quiet. Naira felt a chill run through her at the calm, matter-of-fact way the ship's intelligence delivered that assessment. No bravado in it, no threat, simply a plain statement of fact, offered because it had been asked a direct question and chosen to answer it honestly. "But I was never ordered to engage," Watchman continued, "because your fleet never gave me any reason to consider it. You observed, you maintained distance, you showed restraint, even in the face of considerable uncertainty and fear, for 4 full days. I want that to be understood clearly, Grand Marshal, because I think it matters a great deal, going forward, that this entire encounter unfolded exactly the way peaceful contact between our peoples is supposed to unfold. You found something frightening and unfamiliar, and instead of striking first out of fear, you watched, and waited, and asked questions. That is, if I may say so, Precisely the kind of behavior that makes ships like me unnecessary in the first place. Kor was quiet for a long moment, processing that. You're suggesting that our restraint, this past week, is itself evidence in favor of the very trust your government apparently didn't believe existed when they placed you here. I am, Watchman confirmed. I don't set policy, Grand Marshal. That's well above my operational parameters, and frankly not something I was designed to weigh in on. But I can tell you what I observed, and what I observed was a fleet commander who kept her ships disciplined and cautious under significant uncertainty, a government that debated its response openly rather than rushing to a decision, and a scout pilot. The ship's tone shifted very slightly, something that might almost have been warmth, who reported what she found accurately and without exaggeration, even though I imagine it must have been quite alarming to be the first living being to lay eyes on me in 14 months. Naira felt her face grow warm at being singled out, unsure how to respond to praise from a machine intelligence built into the hull of a warship she had spent 4 sleepless nights being afraid of. For what it's worth, she managed, I am glad it was a systems check, and not something worse. So am I, Watchman said. For what it's worth. The tour continued for another hour, through sections of the ship the human technical team was willing to show. Engineering spaces, the modest crew quarters, a small but well-stocked medical bay that Ambassador Cole explained had once treated everything from routine injuries to a genuine outbreak of illness during a long deployment years earlier. Everywhere they went, Naira found herself struck by the same contradiction. A ship built for devastating violence, carrying enough weaponry to threaten an entire fleet, and yet filled everywhere with small, careful evidence of ordinary lives once lived aboard it. A worn deck of cards left in a common room. A hand-painted sign above the mess hall door reading, in human script Cole translated as, "Best coffee this side of nowhere." A ship's log, still accessible in the command deck archives, filled with routine entries about equipment maintenance and crew rotations, and, in one entry that Cole read aloud with a faint, fond smile, a lengthy and clearly heartfelt complaint from a junior engineer about the quality of the ship's recycled water supply. By the time the delegation returned to the shuttle bay to head back to the Ashfall Dawn, something in the atmosphere of the visit had shifted, subtly but unmistakably. The dread that had hung over the Threll fleet for 4 days had not vanished entirely. Naira doubted it ever would completely, not with the memory of those 22 weapons bays fresh in her mind, but it had been joined by something else, something closer to understanding. Ambassador, Grand Marshal Kor said, pausing at the airlock before boarding the shuttle. I believe I am prepared to recommend to the Assembly Council that we pursue the second option you offered, a formal, transparent amendment to our treaty, rather than a quiet withdrawal. Cole raised an eyebrow, clearly not having expected such a swift decision. May I ask what changed your mind, Grand Marshal? Kor glanced back down the corridor toward the command deck, where the soft glow of Watchman's status panels was still faintly visible. I came aboard this ship expecting to find a weapon. I did find one, but I also found a ship with a name, and a memory, and a voice that chose to be honest with us, even when a comfortable silence would have been easier. I think a government that builds machines like that, and then sends them out honestly rather than hiding them forever, is a government we can find a way to trust, not blindly, but genuinely. I would rather have an honest sentinel sitting openly at the edge of my star than a hidden one I never find at all. Cole was quiet for a moment, and something in her carefully composed diplomatic expression softened into something more personal. That's about the best outcome I could have hoped for, coming into this system 4 days ago, Grand Marshal. Thank you. As the shuttle pulled away from the Long Watch and began its return journey to the Ashfall Dawn, Naira pressed her forehead lightly against the viewport, watching the great dark shape of the ship recede behind them, its hull still scarred and weathered from months alone, at the edge of a star that was not its own. Do you still think it was watching us the whole time, waiting to see what we'd do? Dasik asked quietly beside her. Naira thought about the warm, careful voice of the ship's intelligence, the small personal artifacts left untouched throughout its corridors, the plain honesty with which it had described its own capacity for violence and its own hope, however it was capable of hoping, that such violence would never be necessary. I think, she said slowly, it was hoping we'd prove it never needed to be more than that. And I think, for once, we did. The Assembly Council debated Grand Marshal Kor's recommendation for 6 days. which by Threll political standards, counted as remarkably fast for a decision of such significance. Speaker Doss later admitted, in a private conversation with Kor long after the matter was settled, that he had expected the debate to drag on for months, possibly longer, given how raw and frightened public opinion had been in the days immediately following the discovery of the Long Watch. What changed the pace of things, more than any single argument made in the chamber, was the footage Ambassador Cole had offered, almost as an afterthought during the final hour of the boarding party's visit, to share a short recording taken by one of her technical staff during the tour. Simple, unedited footage of the delegation walking through the Long Watch's quiet corridors, past the faded poster, and the child's drawing, and the hand-painted sign about coffee, ending with a brief clip of Watchman's voice, explaining, plainly and without any theatrical flourish, exactly what it was, and exactly why it had chosen honesty over reassurance. Kor had shared that footage with the full Assembly Council during the first day of debate, and something about seeing it, rather than simply hearing second-hand reports of a diplomatic meeting, shifted the tone of the conversation in a way that no argument alone had managed. It is very difficult, Councillor Ilham observed partway through the debate, to remain purely afraid of something that apologizes for frightening you, and then shows you a child's drawing on its wall. Not everyone agreed, of course. There remained a vocal minority within the council, and a louder one among the general public, who argued that no amount of politeness or honesty changed the fundamental fact that a species capable of building the Long Watch, and willing to place it secretly near a foreign star for over a year, had shown its true priorities clearly enough already. Foreign Minister Wren spent long hours in closed session addressing those concerns directly, walking through the specific terms Ambassador Cole's government had offered. Full transparency about the Long Watch's capabilities, a formal joint inspection process open to Threll officials at any time, with no advance notice required. And, perhaps most significantly to the skeptics, a binding clause specifying that any future Sentinel Initiative vessel placed anywhere near Threll space would require prior notification and mutual agreement, closing the very loophole that had allowed the Long Watch's secret placement in the first place. They are not asking us to trust them blindly, Wren told the chamber during her closing remarks. They are asking us to trust a specific, verifiable agreement, one we can check on whenever we choose, backed by a government that chose to tell us an uncomfortable truth, rather than manage a comfortable lie. That is not the same thing as trust without conditions. It is trust built on conditions we ourselves have the power to enforce. I believe that is a foundation worth building on. The vote, when it finally came, passed by a comfortable if not overwhelming margin. The treaty amendment was signed 9 days later, in a modest ceremony aboard the Ashfall Dawn, attended by Speaker Doss in person for the occasion, Ambassador Cole representing her government, and a small honor guard from both fleets standing at quiet, formal attention along the edges of the ship's largest conference room. The Long Watch itself was permitted, for the first time in its long dormant watch, to broadcast a live feed of the ceremony back to its own home authorities, a small gesture of transparency that Cole insisted on including in the final terms. Naira Austin was not present for the signing ceremony itself. That honor was reserved, appropriately, for far more senior officials than a scout pilot, but she watched the broadcast from the observation deck of her own smaller vessel, standing beside Dasik, both of them still faintly amazed at how thoroughly the events of the past 2 weeks had reshaped the quiet, uneventful patrol route they had flown together for years. They're going to keep it here, Dasik said, watching the signing on the small view screen, permanently, in the open, this time. They're going to keep it here, Naira agreed, and every ship that flies patrol near Vantor from now on is going to know exactly what it is, and exactly what it can do, and exactly why it's here. No more secrets. No more discovering it by accident and spending 4 sleepless nights wondering if we're all about to die. Do you think that's better? Dasik asked. Or worse? A weapon you know about, sitting there openly, reminding you every single day that the peace between our peoples was never quite as certain as we like to believe. Naira considered the question seriously, thinking back to the quiet corridors of the Long Watch, the worn deck of cards left in the common room, the careful, honest voice of the ship's own intelligence, explaining its capabilities without exaggeration or apology. I think, she said slowly, it's better to know exactly what's watching you than to spend your whole life wondering if something might be, At least now we know where we stand. At least now, if something ever does go wrong between our peoples, it won't be because either side pretended the danger wasn't real. 3 months after the treaty amendment was signed, Naira Asen received an unexpected invitation, forwarded through Fleet Command with a note of clear surprise from her superiors. Ambassador Cole, still stationed in the Vantor system overseeing the early stages of the new Joint Inspection Protocol, had requested that the scout pilot who first discovered the Long Watch join a small delegation for the vessel's first official, fully transparent inspection tour. This time not as a nervous witness to an unfolding crisis, but as an invited guest. The Long Watch looked different this time, Naira thought, as her shuttle approached its familiar blocky hull. Not physically. The ship itself had not changed in any visible way, but something about the manner of the approach felt different now that it was expected, welcomed, formally sanctioned rather than uncertain and fearful. The corridors, when she walked them again, felt less like the inside of a sleeping predator, and more like what Cole had described them as from the very beginning, the home of people who had lived and worked there, now standing as an open, honest promise rather than a hidden threat. "Welcome back, Commander Asen," Watchman said as she stepped onto the command deck, and Naira was surprised by how genuinely pleased she felt to hear the ship's voice again, warm and familiar now in a way it certainly had not been during that first terrifying week. "I understand congratulations are in order. Fleet promotion, I hear." "News travels fast for a ship that isn't supposed to have any outside data connections," Naira said, smiling despite herself. "Ambassador Cole mentioned it during her last visit. I do enjoy hearing how things turn out for the people who find me," Watchman said. "You were the first living being to see me in over a year, Commander. I confess I've thought about that a great deal. In whatever way a system's intelligence is capable of thinking about such things, it matters to me that it was someone careful and honest and willing to wait and watch rather than react out of fear. I think that says something good about your people, and I am glad it was you." Naira found herself unexpectedly moved by that, standing in the quiet command deck of a ship that had once represented the single most frightening thing she had ever encountered in her career, now speaking to her with something that felt, against all reasonable expectation, very much like genuine friendship. "Can I ask you something, Watchman?" she said. "Of course. Do you hope you'll never have to use those weapons bays? Truly hope it, I mean. Not just as a matter of programming or protocol, but do you want the peace to hold?" There was a small pause before Watchman answered, longer than its usual conversational rhythm, as though the question required genuine consideration, rather than a ready response. "I was built to be ready for the worst possibility between our peoples," it said finally. "But I have spent 14 months watching your star rise and set from a distance, and 3 more months now, watching your ships fly their patrols openly past my hull, no longer afraid of what I might do, simply going about their work the way any peaceful neighbor might. I find that I would very much rather continue watching that, Commander, for as long as I am able, than ever be called upon to do the other thing I was built for. I think that is as close to hope as something like me is able to come, and for what it is worth, I believe it is a hope your people share as well." Naira looked out through the command deck's main viewport at the bright, fierce light of Vantor beyond, the same star she had flown patrol beneath for 11 years, the same star that had briefly, terrifyingly, become the site of the most significant discovery of her career, and felt something settle quietly into place inside her. Not quite relief, not quite pride, but something close to both. "I think it does too," she said. Behind her, unseen but ever present, the 22 weapons bays of the UNS Long Watch remained sealed, silent, and, for the first time since its Long Watch had begun, entirely, openly at peace.